Hello and welcome back. So we're at the All-Star break, and that is a great place to pause and take a look at some longer-term trends and some deeper analysis that can help us make a push for the playoffs. So today we're going to look at which teams have been the best to mine fantasy value out of, and we'll go over teams with the most amount of elite players on them, teams with the highest number of quality waiver ads, and the purpose of all this is to give you a better sense of which teams to keep in the back of your mind when you're making additions or subtractions to your roster. So there's two parts to this video. We're going to cover leagues without hits and blocks and then leagues with hits and blocks. So let's jump into it with the non-hits and blocks leagues. And for this purpose, we'll be looking at the Data Draft Player Hub rankings, which covers points, goals, assists, shots, and power play points per game. So those 5 metrics are what goes into the rating for the non-hits and blocks Player Hub. So right off the bat, what you're looking at here is the number of players on each team that rank above a 90 on the Data Draft Player Hub without hits and blocks. So it's a bit of a surprise that Ottawa ranks number 1 with 5 players over 90. And you can see those 5 players here: Tkachuk, Stützle, Giroux, Batherson, DeBrincat. Those are all above 90 players, and that's 5 of their top 6. Now, the other guy in that top 6 would have likely have been Josh Norris, but he's obviously had some injury history, hasn't been able to stay healthy, and he'll be out for the rest of the season. So it will be interesting to note who they put in that top 6, because whoever they do, they have elite level exposure. And Ridley Gregg is currently listed as the second-line center and has 2 points in 4 games this year, all of which came in the last week plus. Something to keep an eye on, since literally everyone he's playing with is elite level in terms of offensive production. Now, we also have Buffalo, Colorado, Edmonton, and Jersey, and Toronto with 4 players. And I bet if you tried, you could probably guess each of those players on each of those teams that has a 90-plus rating. But the next thing you want to notice is at the bottom, all the teams that have 0 players over 90, and that could mean 2 things. Either A, they simply aren't good teams, Anaheim, Arizona, Chicago, Montreal, or B, they are very balanced, and that's what you get with Seattle. So we will see a taste of Seattle going forward, but for this purpose, they do not have a single player who's above a 90, which means that they have incredible depth on their team. Now, what this exercise shows you is the teams that have the most elite players. And if you can find a guy on the waiver wire who's getting you exposure to them on a given week, those players are more likely to pay off. But what it also shows you is the top-heavy teams in the NHL, as some of those teams with several 90-plus players don't have guys in the 70s and 80s that will be available for you on the waiver wire. So in order to kind of drive down on that point, let's take a look at the guys rated 80 or above and how many of those players each team has. So this is the same thing, but this is players above 80. And this also includes all of those 90s players as well. So what you get from this graph, you notice Boston is at the top, and that's to be expected. So for Boston, the best team in the league, maybe one of the best regular season teams in the history of the league. And you're going to expect that they'd have a number of excellent players, and you can see them right here. So you have Pasternak, Marchand, they're obviously going to be in the 90s. DeBrusk has had a nice, surprising season, finally getting out from under Bruce Cassidy, and that's kind of unlocked his potential. He's a shot volume guy, getting some goal production as well. Then you obviously have Bergeron, Krejci. They're always going to be closer to the top. McAvoy's having a good season. And then you also have Taylor Hall, who's at 80% right now. This is what you're getting out of these rankings. This is what percentile they rank in the entire league, essentially. So to have Taylor Hall being that effective as essentially a third liner at most times of the season, he does get up there and play with some of the big boys every now and then. But still, these are the guys that are getting it done in Boston, and they still have some guys who are fantasy relevant who are probably available on your wire. Pavel Zacha had a really nice game I think it was last night, 2 goals against Toronto, so he's available for you on your wire. And that means that this team is very deep, but they're very top-heavy deep. So a lot of these guys are owned up. You're not going to get access to a lot of them, but Krejci is frequently on the wire, and so is maybe Taylor Hall and Pavel Zacha. So this is something to keep in mind going forward. Now, you also see Florida at the top. And for Florida, you wouldn't necessarily expect this with the struggles that they've had, but their offense is still relatively good, despite dropping from 4.1 goals per game to 3.4 goals per game. They have 2 guys in the 90s, obviously Tkachuk and Barkov. Both of those guys have been excellent, and they're both all-stars this year. But Brandon Montour has been an elite defenseman, especially when it comes to offensive category coverage. He's been doing basically what Aaron Ekblad was doing for them last year, as I mentioned in the Florida Panthers video. Sam Reinhart, he's been kind of finding his game lately. Verhaeghe's having a career year, especially when it comes to goal scoring and shot volume, as we mentioned previously. And then Aaron Ekblad, he's starting to find his game slowly but surely, and he's a little bit more valuable in leagues with little extra peripheral coverage. Sam Bennett, he's typically more valuable in a hits league, but he does get some volume in terms of shots and some other category coverage. But these guys, I mean, again, you get some guys in the 70s that are also ownable, Forsling and Lundell. Lundell is a perfect example of a guy, he's usually a third-line center, but when they had him up with Barkov and I believe it was Tkachuk on the top line, he was, one of those waiver ads that you could find that you could put with those elite guys and get a lot of fantasy value out of. And I try to highlight that on the weekly videos, but this is another way to do that, to look at the teams that have those guys and try to match up waiver-eligible guys with those line assignments. Now, again, if we look at the bottom, we see the teams that you don't want to try to pick players off of. Chicago, only 2 players that are 80 or above, and that's Kane and Domi. Anaheim has Terry and Zegras, so both of those teams are not going to get you a lot in terms of offensive category coverage. Goals, assists, points, power play, shots, etc. Those are the only 4 guys on both of those teams that you would potentially want access to. And then notice that Nashville only has 3 players 80 or above. Yossi and Forsberg are over 90, and Duchesne's an 85. And that's not really good news for Predators fans, as all of the teams around them are pretty much non-playoff teams. Same kind of thing goes for Calgary. Toffoli's a 90, Lindholm's an 89, Kadri's an 88. They do have 5 players in the 70s, but this is a far cry from the team that they had last year with 3 elite players who would have been in the 90s. So some concerning trends down at the bottom, but let's get a little bit deeper into the analysis and go to the next level. This is the most players rated in the 70s, so between 70 and 80. And what you're looking at here, so basically in this league format without hits and blocks, anything above a 70 is going to be a top 250 player in fantasy. So basically the league size is around 850 players. When you take out when you do the analysis, the top 30% is what you're looking at in terms of guys who are going to be fantasy relevant for most league formats and league sizes, 10, 12, 14 team leagues mainly. But what you're looking at here, so first look at the bottom. Let's start by looking at the bottom on this one. You see the Rangers, Oilers, Stars, and Columbus. So for 3 of those 4 teams, obviously the Columbus Blue Jackets are not part of this, but you get very top-heavy teams that don't have a lot of guys in the 70s for you to pluck off the waiver wire. And you obviously notice that the Rangers are obviously top-heavy. Zibanejad, Kreider, Panarin, Fox, all those guys are owned up, so you're not going to get access to them on the wire. Same thing with Edmonton. I've gone over that in a couple of weekly videos. There's just nothing to mine in the middle. You either get elite guys at the top and some crappy guys at the bottom, but nothing in that middle where you could potentially find some fantasy value. Now, Toronto, Winnipeg, Colorado, and Ottawa are similar in that their offenses have a number of great players, but you probably either own them or you don't. You're not finding much value from those teams on the wire, although I'll admit Colorado has Lehkonen and Nichushkin, along with Rodriguez and Compher to choose from, Compher being the lone 70s player at 78. But there is a little bit of value there, but just not quite as much because these teams are also pretty top-heavy. So here you get either top-heavy teams or teams that are not playoff teams, like Montreal. Maybe Ottawa's not a playoff team because they're very top-heavy as well. But these teams don't leave you a lot on the waiver wire. But what about the teams at the top? So Washington has actually been a sneaky place to mine fantasy value this year. And I'll admit, I don't give them enough attention sometimes. Though I have covered guys like Gustafsson and Carlson in certain videos. You can see here Tom Wilson, he's a 60. He's climbing up there, but he's obviously a little bit more valuable in hits leagues. This is not going to take that into account with the non-hits and blocks leagues. Backstrom coming off an injury, so he's not quite up to speed yet. And I don't really know what his ceiling is going to be. Haven't been watching them too closely since he's been back. Hopefully the second half is going to be a little bit more kind to him. But in his absence, Dylan Strome has been pretty productive. An 81 rating right here. With Kuznetsov, you get the same things that you always get: assist coverage, power play production, but not much of anything else.
But there have been some guys. I mean, Gustafsson went off for a period there. Johansson is a pretty reliable deep league streamer. Mantha and Milano are guys I typically wouldn't go to, mainly because they don't cover a lot for me in my league format with hits and blocks and everything else. But in terms of strict offensive coverage, they are getting their top 70th percentile in the league. But yeah, these are some of the guys that you're going to get access to, and a lot of these guys are going to be available on your wire. Guys like Connor Sherry having a really nice year. TJ Oshie's probably not there because he does have name value, but these are some of the guys that you can potentially mine out of Washington. And it's interesting to note that they are the number one team, the most players rated in the 70s in the data draft player rankings without hits and blocks. But also up there at the top is Carolina. So Carolina, there's a couple interesting names on here that you can get on the waiver wire. Stefan Nason, he's a power play specialist. Otherwise, he's in the low 70s. He doesn't cover a lot, but he does get power play production because he's the net front guy on that power play. Speaking of the power play, Teravainen, very assist heavy, a bit disappointing this year, especially on the power play. So I believe it was last year, he had a .40 power play points per game, which was elite level. This year, it's .15, less than half the production. So a little bit disappointing from Teravainen, and he's still relatively owned up too. I've mentioned a couple times Brady Shea's been playing really well offensively this year. You have Pacioretty, he's obviously out. Seth Jarvis, he's kind of battling through that sophomore slump, trying to find some production. I would imagine that these guys are going to make a deadline move at some point to try to bring in somebody to fill in for Pacioretty, and that could potentially affect some power play numbers. But nonetheless, these teams at the top are going to give you the most guys that are going to be quality waiver pickups. Anybody above a 70 in a league without hits and blocks is going to be a quality waiver pickup, and these guys have the most of them. And we'll cover some of these other teams going forward. So let's get to the next slide. Now, this is the number of players rated 70 or above. So what we just saw was just players 70 to 80, and that's the range where you're going to find waiver ads. This is the most players above 70. So it's a little bit different because it encompasses everybody. But the number one thing, the reason why I added this is because of LA. LA has a number of players to mine fantasy value out of this year. And I've mentioned it since before the season started. That second line with Arvidsson, Deneau, and Moore, they were excellent last year. They're good again this year. They're usually around 30% owned, so they're good streaming options in 10 and 12 team leagues. You can see some other guys getting it done too. Velarde started really hot. He has his moments every now and then. Iafallo's been good after returning from injury. Kaliev is a specialty tool that produces in minimal ice time. I'd like to see him get a little bit more ice time, and they've been giving it to him here and there. And then you have two solid D options as well in Doughty and Dursey, and they're both relatively productive. So you're getting a ton of guys. And right now you have Quentin Byfield, who's playing top 6 minutes, and he hasn't necessarily had the production to bump him up in the ratings yet. But this is that's a perfect example of putting a guy who's not fantasy relevant with guys who are exceptional in terms of I think he's playing with Kopitar and Kempe. So this is how you mine fantasy value. You find teams like this that you can find a number of guys off the waiver wire, and anytime that they have a good week where they're getting 4 games in a week, you pluck some of these guys off of that and put them into your roster. Now, looking at the other end of the graph, Montreal and Columbus are starved for fantasy relevant players, though Montreal does have 5 players above a 59 rating. So in deeper leagues, they actually have provided some value, but not for 10 and 12 team leagues, 14 team leagues. I was mentioning that with somebody on Instagram last night. They said that Montreal had been a good place to mine value, but it's probably a deeper league type of thing. You notice that the bottom of this graph has a lot of teams at the bottom of the standings, but also the Leafs, who we established earlier, are top heavy, and this is pretty much common sense anyways. But the same goes for the Rangers, Nashville, even Jersey and Minnesota. Not a lot of depth in terms of the middle type of forwards that you're going to, or not just forwards, forwards and D, that you're going to potentially want to find on the waiver wire. These are teams that, if you don't own the superstar talent, you likely aren't going to get much value from those teams specifically. But there is one other team I wanted to touch on because we talked about it in the first slide, and that is Seattle. They get it done by committee. They don't have anybody over a 90, and you can see a number of different options that are almost all available on your waiver wire. So the only players above 50% owned right now are Vince Dunn and Adam Larson. Beniers is 44%, Burakovsky's 41%, but other than that, everyone is below 30% ownership on Yahoo right now. So they're all available for you. Even some of the players under 70 are value because they cover more than one category. So a guy like Tolvanen has started to find his scoring touch. He's scoring goals, getting some power play production. Obviously, Brandon Tanev is an option in bangers leagues. He's a 3+ hit per game kind of guy with some offensive touch. Gord's been a little bit underwhelming. Donato has had his moments. Wenberg as well. So there's a lot to mine in terms of fantasy value in Seattle. And they are right here towards the top, and we'll cover some of these other teams as well as we move forward. But this is going to do it for the non-hits and blocks leagues. So let's transition to the bangers leagues with hits and blocks. And as we turn to the hits and blocks leagues, we're all looking at the Data Draft Player Hub rankings, which you can access in the Patreon link in the description and get access to not only the player rankings that we're looking at today, but the player hubs that I use in almost every one of my videos now. So, but here you see LA is at the top, still giving you a lot of players to choose from, even in bangers leagues. But you also see Colorado and Pittsburgh close behind with 9 players above a 65 rating. Now, quick side note, the reasons that the rating numbers are skewed a little bit lower is because it's harder for elite offensive players to cover hits and blocks as well. So this hub essentially shows how complete a player is in terms of category coverage in hits and blocks leagues. So Makar on Colorado is the 3rd highest rated player on the Data Draft Player Hub, the highest being Rasmus Dahlin at a 90, so that gives you a sense of the numbers being a bit lower. McKinnon, Rantanen, those guys are obviously elite and they're owned up. Then you get to Lehkonen and Nichushkin, who's elite level and when he's healthy, I think he should be healthy after the All-Star break, and both are only 72% owned. They should be owned up more than that, and if they're available, go grab them and ride them for the rest of the season, especially with their favorable playoff schedule, which I mentioned in the playoff schedule video. So if you haven't checked that out, do yourself a favor and look at that. It'll give you a preview of what you can look for in terms of navigating the schedule for your playoff weeks. Obviously some other guys on here. Taves having a sneaky good season. I've been mentioning Comfer and Rodriguez for about a month now. Bowen Byram, when he's healthy, he's been pretty good. So a lot of these guys have been excellent in bangers leagues for hits and blocks coverage as well as the offensive production. But before we move on, look at the teams at the bottom. So Seattle's down there, but they have a lot of guys that just below that threshold of 65. Same thing with Montreal. Chicago, only 2 players above a 65, and that's pitiful. But on this hub, those 2 players are Seth Jones and Tyler Johnson. So if you're in a bangers league without plus minus, because if you have plus minus, they're going to kill you. But with no plus minus, those are some decent targets if they're on your wire. The reason why Kane and Domi aren't there is just they're not hits and blocks guys. They don't get any hits and blocks at all, so they're a little bit lower. Obviously, they're elite level for, as we saw earlier, they're the 2 guys that are ownable in non-hits and blocks leagues. But as we move on, this is the number of players rated 70 or above. This is the sweet spot. So over 70 rating for hits and blocks leagues is what I look for in a 12-team league. Ideally, it's a player above 70, and for this purpose, Pittsburgh has been very strong in producing complete fantasy players for hits and blocks leagues. So Letang, he covers hits and blocks at an elite level, 93rd and 94th percentile respectively, and he gets the offensive production as well, making him somewhat of a unicorn. Raquel has been surprisingly good this year, especially with his shot volume, 93rd percentile, and over a hit and a half per game. Zucker, I've mentioned before, one of the best goal-scoring hitters you can find on your waiver wire. And then Ty Smith was good in his limited time with Petrie and Letang injured. But nonetheless, Pittsburgh has been treading water with some injuries to key players. Right now with Letang and Petrie back, it's actually Jari who's hurting them. Because he can't get it back in the lineup, and they desperately need him to be the elite level goaltender that he is. But if they can put it all together down the stretch, they become a very valuable fantasy team heading into your playoffs. As you can see here, they have a number of guys that you would potentially want access to. Now, the last thing we'll cover today, these are teams with the most and least 70s rated players, aka the most quality waiver streaming options for fantasy in hits and blocks leagues. So we covered LA. Let's look at the other teams at the top here in green. What you're looking at, these teams here, these have the most amount of players in the 70s that you can potentially find some value out of. So first we have St. Louis. Obviously, their offense went from 3.77 goals per game to 3 goals per game. So a lot of their offensive producers have regressed, especially guys like Ryan O'Reilly. But they do have 2 excellent power play quarterback defensemen on here, along with some really good offensive options. Kairu, Tarasenko, Shen, Buchnevich, even Thomas from time to time. Some of those guys, most of those guys are going to be owned up. I've seen Thomas on the waiver wire a couple times. I saw Buchnevich at times. Braden Shen every now and then ends up on my wire. So if they're there, these are guys that are going to give you quality production when you can get them off the waiver wire. Up next, the Islanders. So Bo Horvat got traded after this hub, so he's not on here, but he would be at the top. He's a 78. He becomes their best, most complete fantasy option. As far as the guys on this list, Anders Lee is elite for goals and shots, solid across everything else. Nelson is elite in all offensive categories, but doesn't hit or block much. JG Pajot is basically the opposite of that, and also wins a ton of faceoffs for faceoff leagues. Palmieri has been rising quickly, as I mentioned in the weekly video last week. But that's, this is something that you're going to want to keep an eye on, especially if you're paying attention to the Horvat deal and trying to gain some access to some of these guys. Maybe Palmieri becomes a little bit more valuable. Maybe, Brock Nelson, Anders Lee, if they're playing with him. Barzell's the obvious target, but he's probably going to be owned up. But next, let's take a look at Vegas really quickly. Tough news on the Mark Stone front, and for them to have 2 of their best players having back surgery in back-to-back years isn't a good sign going forward. Chandler Stevenson's been a solid player all year. Elite in assists, pretty light on shot volume though. And he doesn't have the name value, but he's probably deserving of the all-star replacement nod. Now, Riley Smith has been underwhelming in the last 2 months or so, but still 90th percentile in goals, 86th in shots, and may get some more top 6 minutes with Stone out, so that's something to keep an eye on. But a lot of guys to mine in terms of fantasy value, Carlson, Smith, Marchessault, that entire line is usually a really good producing line. Sometimes you can find those guys on your waiver wire. And when we look at the bottom, we also have to talk about one other team, and that is Vancouver. So if we're looking at these teams with the zeros down here, these guys don't have anybody that's a quality waiver stream that you can usually pick up. And the number one team that we want to talk about here is Vancouver because they just lost Bo Horvat. So I'll bring up Vancouver. Pettersson, Miller, they're both elite level. They remain fantasy relevant even with Horvat gone. Quinn Hughes is still what he is, an assist-heavy power play quarterback defenseman with not much hits or blocks coverage. Besser's been okay offensively, but surprisingly assist-heavy and no hits or blocks to mention. Kuzmenko may increase in terms of his role, especially on the power play, so that's one player I would maybe expect a bump after this deal. Mikheyev potentially also. Both of those guys were playing second-line minutes and getting some power play time. Kuzmenko, I would imagine, would be the more valuable of the two with his power play exposure. But, as it stands, some of these guys are not good enough for 12-team hits and blocks leagues. But do I think Besser and others will be on the move? It's hard to say. I wouldn't bank on Besser rocketing up his production if he does get traded, though. I've heard a lot of guys asking me about Besser and if he gets traded, what happens. His highest 3 seasons have been .88, .87, and .81 points per game, and around a mid to high 20 goal pace. So he's really not elite level. Even if he does get moved and has this amazing turnaround, I don't think it's going to be a kind of elite player that you're going to potentially find now and hope that he gets traded and have it work out for you and win your league. But nonetheless, this was a look at some of the best and worst teams to mine fantasy value out of for both hits and blocks leagues and non-hits and blocks leagues. Hopefully you can keep these teams in the back of your mind when making waiver plays or targeting players for trades. Hopefully you got some insight out of this exercise, and if you did, please like and subscribe. Any little bit helps the channel. Follow on Twitter and Instagram at @data_draft for more shorter form content and quick updates and a few betting plays every now and then. But that's going to do it for this one. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next one.